now that we have these layout containers, we need to put something in them. And these are the modules. The modules are essentially the content pieces. So when looking at something like a Yahoo Mail, they're the tabs. It's the customized list view. It's the buttons. These are the things that are actually going to contain our content. And all of these things go inside our layout. So modules contain content and are the majority of your site. So if you could imagine kind of this 10,000-foot view of your CSS, your base styles is this sort of small thing over here. You've got layout, which is maybe a slightly bigger thing over here, defining your overall layout or your grid system. And then your modules is everything else. This is like 90% of your project are the individual modules for that particular project. Now, keep in mind that each module that you create is an interface that your users need to learn. This is something that I often see with designers, especially a team of designers. So, I mentioned earlier, when you throw a design over to 5 different engineering teams, you're going to get 5 things back. At the same time, give a design problem to 5 different designers, you're going to get 5 different solutions back. And this is a pattern that I've seen on a lot of different projects where a designer will solve a problem, and it's like, that's a great way to solve that problem. And then it gets implemented. But it turns out that that problem was actually solved in a different way. And each of those ways is something that your users are going to have to learn. And as somebody who has to build that stuff out, it's also code that has to be written, delivered to the end user, and maintained by the development team. So these are things that you want to keep in mind. And so this, as you look at all those modules, how much is that growing? If it's growing too far, there might be this opportunity to recognize that growth and figure out where you can pare that back. Taking a look at, I remember at one point looking at the Yahoo typography. And I was like, okay, well, how many different font sizes are we using? And it turned out we were using about 24 different font sizes. That seemed like a lot. Can our users see the difference between 23 and 24 pixel font? Probably not. And so we ended up actually having that opportunity to simplify our code base and identify, okay, you know what? In this case, we probably only need about half a dozen font sizes. 11, 12, 14, 16, 18, 24. And slotting everything else into that system allowed us to simplify our code, simplify the design language, and at the end of the day, deliver less code over to our users. So these are the opportunities, as we modularize our code to identify those types of things. Now, a module may have variations on them. In the book, I call them submodules. So you have this thing that might need to appear in a slightly different way. So for example, buttons. With Yahoo Mail, we had a lot of buttons. We had small buttons, large buttons, dark buttons, search buttons, default buttons that appeared in a modal dialog and let you know what the default action was. We had a lot of different buttons. But a lot of them were based on very similar styles. They all had the same border radius. They had the same drop shadow, the same font size. There was usually only 1 or 2 differences between each one. Maybe the color of the button was different. Or maybe the typography needed to be a little bit bigger, such as in like the search buttons. Or with the large buttons, we needed to be able to put an image above the text as opposed to maybe beside the text. So these types of things that we're trying to do, we just need to identify, okay, what is our base module? And then what are the module variations? What are our submodules? And again, we're dealing with a single HTML element. The single HTML element needs to be displayed in slightly different ways. So when you're building stuff out, It's interesting to kind of be able to recognize, and sometimes it's a little difficult because we tend to look at things based on the context of where they are. So at Shopify, we were working on this little drop-down widget. Click on the Actions button, this drop-down, it's got a little fang on it that points up, divot, I don't know what you want to call that thing. Somebody needs to standardize that, I think. But it had like a slight rounded corner. We had these blue links. This drop-down had a certain number of properties. We ended up actually using this drop-down in a bunch of different places. So here with the Actions drop-down, if you click on the Filter button over there, there was a filter drop-down. If you were on the customer screen and you hovered over the customer name, there was a little customer card that came up. And when you did a search, you got this drop-down. Now, the code, how this was actually originally coded, the designer said, hey, you know what? This is a search autocomplete. So I'm going to create a search autocomplete drop-down. And they coded it all as this one piece, the input, the drop-down. And it was like, well, you know what? There's not a lot of difference between that and that. Can we actually reuse a lot of these styles? Instead of creating a completely new CSS, can we reuse stuff? And in fact, the designer actually looked at this and went, well, you know what? Since we've already got an existing pattern, why don't we just use it? When you actually search, you now actually get a drop-down that looks exactly like the other one. I don't have to create any additional code in this particular case. And these are the types of opportunities that you have. Well, look, we're identifying this code that we're creating. We've solved this design pattern in two different ways. Can we consolidate that? The customer cards that I mentioned were also built as a completely separate widget. So the drop shadows actually ended up being slightly different. They didn't have the slightly rounded corners. And again, the designer went, well, it's a drop down like any other. Like it had the little fang, and this is an opportunity to refactor that and bring that in line. And so in a case where we actually had 3 different widgets, they were actually the same widget, and we were able to reduce a lot of our code by identifying these kind of patterns. Now, you know, I talk about how a module is one particular element, but there are often modules that have child elements that actually relate to that root module. And so these child elements, again, in the book, I call them subcomponents. In retrospect, calling them subcomponents versus submodules is probably confusing. Yeah, so we've got these module child elements that we want to associate with that root module node. So for example, a modal dialog, the content of this modal dialog could be completely different any number of times. I might have, in this case, an add a variant modal, but I might have add an event, add a discount, add whatever, that I have all these different modal dialogues. The modal itself always has a header, always has a footer. I've always got some buttons on the right. I've got the title up in the top left. I have this recurring pattern, but the content in there could be completely different. It could be just a wall of text. It could be a form. It could be any number of things. So I need some way of identifying that HTML element for the header, and I need some way of identifying this HTML element for the footer, and for the body container, set up an overflow so I can scroll this box. I want to identify these 3 elements and associate them with the root module. The other thing is that we want to essentially isolate this module. You know, where I have a node and I've got a child node, that I want this thing to say, okay, it is its own thing that is separate from all the other HTML elements on the page. So how do I identify this thing as its own thing? And I want to isolate it also from other child elements. So I may have a module inside of a module, inside of a module, inside of a layout. And we can often have styles that are declared on the outer container that are affecting stuff way down below. And There are ways that we can approach isolating these things so that my module, starts at one place, ends at another, and doesn't affect anything else above, below, or around it. So just to kind of give you a quick code example to explain that, where we have, let's say, this outer div where we've got a modal. Inside that, we've got a modal header, modal body, modal footer. We have some buttons in here. So this is a glimpse at naming convention, which we'll get into briefly. We now have this way of identifying all these different elements. So the purpose of the modules is to isolate them from each other and prevent styles from coming in from outside and from those styles bleeding out.